Welcome back to Philosophy Friday here on Study Hall. Are you ready to exercise those brain muscles a little bit?
Always.
Today we're going to say kind of a topic that's a bit unexpected, maybe even a little taboo for some.
Ooh.
We're going to be talking about how societies, particularly in the West, have talked about sex over the past few centuries.
And you might be surprised to learn that this isn't just about, changing attitudes towards sexuality,
Right?
It's about power.
Power. Okay.
Who gets to talk about sex, how they talk about it, and what that tells us about the larger social and political landscape,
So you're telling me there's a philosophical angle to all of this?
Absolutely.
All right, I've got my thinking cap on. Lead the way.
All right, let's go.
Our sources today are packed with historical tidbits and surprising shifts in perspective.
Totally. And to really get this, we need to challenge some of those assumptions we often have about the history of sex. For example, think about the 17th century. What comes to mind?
Well, I'm picturing a pretty buttoned-up era, lots of repression, whispering behind fans, that sort of thing.
Right.
Isn't that what most people think of when they think about sex in the 1600s? All hush-hush.
Exactly. It's what we call the repressive hypothesis. But the sources we're looking at today suggest it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
While it's true that open discussion about sex became less common, sex wasn't simply silenced. It was more like it went underground, becoming the subject of a very particular kind of linguistic game.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this linguistic game. What was going on?
Think of it like this. Even prohibitions and condemnations of sex avoided using direct terms. They danced around the subject. Using euphemisms and indirect references, it's almost as if the act of directly naming sex was considered too powerful, too dangerous.
So like a linguistic game of hot potato, but with a very loaded topic.
Precisely. But here's where things get really interesting. While everyday language became more veiled, there was one place where talking about sex in detail was not only allowed, but actually required the Catholic confessional.
Now that's a twist. So while society was getting all coy about sex, the church was going in the opposite direction.
In a way, yes. After the Council of Trent, there was a significant shift in confessional practices. While the language used became more delicate, the scope of what had to be confessed expanded dramatically.
Okay.
Suddenly, it wasn't just about actions. People were expected to confess their thoughts, desires, even fleeting images related to sex.
Wow, imagine having to confess every single thought you had about sex.
I know, right?
It seems like it would make those thoughts even more intense, more present in your mind.
That's a fascinating point, isn't it? Does forcing that level of introspection, that meticulous self-examination, ultimately silence or fuel certain desires? It's like shining a spotlight on something that was meant to stay hidden. Does it make it more or less powerful?
You've definitely got me thinking, okay, so we've got this seemingly contradictory situation in the 17th century. Society is shying away from open discussions about sex, while the church is demanding incredibly detailed confessions. Where do things go from there?
Well, that's where we see a dramatic shift in the 18th century. This era sees a veritable explosion of discourses on sex, but not in the way you might expect. It's not about liberation or free love, it's about power.
Power.
Institutions and governments suddenly become very interested in talking about classifying and ultimately controlling sex.
Hold on, Pat. What do you mean? Were they reading people's diaries or something? How are they controlling sex?
Not quite diaries, but think about it this way. Population emerges as a major political and economic concern in the 18th century. Governments become obsessed with understanding birth rates, marriage ages, anything that influences population growth.
So suddenly sex wasn't just a private matter between individuals. It was data, a matter of state interest.
Exactly. They needed to know about it, to quantify it, to manage it. And it wasn't just about numbers either. There was also a growing preoccupation with children's sexuality.
Wait, children's sexuality? I did not see that coming. What was the thinking there?
Well, childhood became increasingly seen as a period that needed to be carefully managed, especially when it came to sexuality. We see a proliferation of literature aimed at educators' guidelines for monitoring children's behavior, even public examinations related to the sexuality of schoolboys.
So it's not that they wanted to silence children's sexuality. It's more like they wanted to define it, control it, fit it into a certain mold.
Precisely. And this brings us to a key point. The way we talk about sex, the language we use, the questions we ask, all of this has a profound impact on how we understand and experience it. And this trend of classifying and controlling sexuality continues into the 19th century, where we see the emergence of a concept called perverse implantation.
Okay, perverse implantation. That sounds intense. Break that down for me. What does that even mean?
Well, it's not about simply repressing what were considered deviant sexualities. It's about incorporating them into the dominant discourse, giving them names, analyzing them, and turning those classifications into identities.
So instead of trying to sweep these deviant sexualities under the rug, they were putting them under a microscope, making them a subject of scientific study.
Exactly. And the sources we're looking at suggest this had some pretty significant consequences. For example, think about the emergence of the homosexual as a specific type of person with an inherent nature, as opposed to just someone who engaged in certain acts.
That's a huge shift. So going from judging actions to labeling people.
Yeah.
We're basically saying that this way of talking about sex, this perverse implantation,
Hmm.
actually helped create the categories and identities we use to understand sexuality today.
It's a complex issue, of course, but the sources definitely suggest that this period played a significant role in shaping our modern understanding of sexual identity.
And I bet there were some unintended consequences too, right? Like if you focus so much attention on something, even if it's to condemn it, doesn't that make it more present, more alluring in a way?
You're absolutely right. The more you try to define and control something, the more it seems to slip through your fingers. It's like a paradox.
It's like that old saying, forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest. So we've gone from relative silence to detailed confessions to governments getting in on the act and classifying everything. Where does that leave us today? What's changed and what stayed the same?
Well, one thing that hasn't changed is the link between power and pleasure when it comes to talking about sex. There's a certain thrill, a fascination that seems to accompany the act of revealing, analyzing, and controlling something that's considered taboo or forbidden.
It's like this hidden knowledge that people in power get to explore and define. And for the listener hearing those stories, those confessions can also be a source of fascination, even arousal.
Think about the example we discussed earlier, that Englishman who found pleasure in meticulously documenting his sexual experiences. It wasn't just about the experiences themselves, it was about the act of narrating them, of putting them into words. It's like the talking about it becomes part of the pleasure.
It's almost like those 17th century confessions all over again, even if the language was veiled. The act of revealing those desires, even in a context of guilt and repentance, might have had a certain allure.
Absolutely. It creates this intriguing dynamic where the act of speaking about sex, even if it's meant to condemn or control it, can become a source of pleasure in and of itself.
So it's like this self-perpetuating cycle. The more we talk about sex, the more it gets tangled up with power and pleasure, and that just fuels the desire to talk about it even more.
And that's why it's so important to be critical of the discourses we encounter, to be aware of the hidden agendas, the power dynamics that shape the way we talk about sex, because ultimately how we talk about it has a profound impact on how we understand and experience our own sexuality.
Okay, so let me get this straight. We've gone from silence to detailed confessions to scientific classifications, and through it all, there's this constant interplay of power and pleasure. But where does that leave us today? What does our way of talking about sex reveal about the power dynamics at play in the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're swimming in a sea of discourses about sex, from the media we consume to the policies that govern our lives. But how much of that talk is truly liberating? How much of it is still shaped by those same old power dynamics, even if they're more subtle and disguised now?
So what are some of the questions we should be asking ourselves as we navigate this complex landscape? How can we be more aware of those hidden agendas and power structures you mentioned?
Well, for starters, I think it's crucial to ask who benefits from these particular ways of talking about sex? What are the unspoken assumptions, the biases, the power structures that are being reinforced? And perhaps most importantly, how can we create a discourse that is more inclusive, more liberating, more empowering for everyone?
Those are some heavy questions to ponder. It's like you're saying, we need to develop a whole new philosophy of talking about sex, one that's more aware of these historical patterns and power dynamics.
Yeah, it's not enough to just talk about sex more openly. We need to be mindful of how we talk about it, whose voices are being heard and whose experiences are being marginalized or silenced.
So it's not just about freedom of speech. It's about creating a space for a truly inclusive and equitable conversation about sex.
Precisely, and I think the sources we've looked at today give us some valuable insights into how to do that. For example, remember how we talked about the unintended consequences of focusing so much on deviant sexualities? It's like the more you try to suppress something, the more it becomes the center of attention.
Yeah, it's like the whole forbidden fruit thing again. So are you saying we should just stop talking about things like sexual norms and deviance altogether? Isn't that kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Not necessarily, it's not about ignoring those issues, but about approaching them in a different way instead of focusing on categorization and control.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to shift our attention to understanding empathy and respect for individual experiences.
Okay, I see what you're saying. It's about moving away from a language of judgment and toward a language of acceptance and understanding.
Exactly. And I think that starts with questioning some of the basic assumptions we often make about sex, assumptions about what's normal or natural, for example.
So maybe we need to deconstruct those categories altogether. Is normal even a useful concept when we're talking about something as diverse and complex as human sexuality?
That's a great question. And it's one that I think each of us needs to grapple with on a personal level because ultimately how we talk about sex, the language we use, the stories we tell, all of this shapes our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with others.
Well, you've certainly given our listeners a lot to think about. Today, we've covered centuries of history, delved into complex philosophical concepts, and even managed to squeeze in a few juicy historical tidbits along the way.
And hopefully we've challenged some of those deeply ingrained assumptions about the history of sex and the way it intersects with power, pleasure, and the very act of speaking.
Exactly, and that's what Philosophy Friday is all about, pushing those boundaries, asking those tough questions, and never settling for easy answers.
So to our listeners, keep those philosophical wheels turning, question everything, embrace the complexity, and remember that the conversation about sex is far from over.
Thanks for joining us on Study Hall. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas.